when I was declared the winner on election night, I did a screen print of the results and posted it to social media and said thank you to all the voters. When I checked the results the next morning, I was down 1,300 votes from the results posted on election night. How it's possible to lose 1,300 votes from election night to the morning of the next day, and why there are these discrepancies in the results being reported to the mainstream media.
The special ballots that were cast in that riding by electors who did not live in that riding amounted to 822 ballots, and they were not counted.
So in terms of the voter information cards themselves, if 60% can't be delivered on time, have they outlived their usefulness?
Just so that I'm clear, is it the case that at present there is no verification done by Elections Canada, that when signatures are presented on the forms that they're taken at face value?
There were 57,440 ballots cast by electors living outside of Canada voting by mail, according to your report. That is a significant increase from the 27,035 cast in the 44th general election. 90 to 100 polls were all in one location. A big public building, very convenient for Elections Canada to be able to do that, but maybe not so convenient for voters.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Pursuant to Standing Order 108, Sub 3, the committee is meeting in public on the report of the 45th general election of April 28th, 2025.
Election night is a very exciting and stressful time for candidates and Canadians alike. I'm sure everyone in this room was on the Elections Canada website on the evening of April 28th, and unfortunately, when we needed it most, elections.ca crashed. According to page 18 of the report, it went down at 7 p.m. on election night and was not fully restored until just after 5 a.m. the next morning. And I strongly suspect even the most hardcore political junkies were fast asleep by 5 a.m. and there was probably a very large reduction in volume and traffic at the website by that late hour. So I was wondering if the witnesses could share with the committee what exactly went wrong with the website and what steps are being taken to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I hope that the technical solution is not to just wait until 5 o'clock in the morning when people stop using the website.
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Many elements to that question. To be clear, it's not technically speaking, the website was not the problem. The web service provider that's behind the website, so our systems were functioning, but people could not access them. So there was a failure of a firewall that is set up by a private partner that provides the web services for us during the election, and that firewall could not handle the spike that we saw on election night. We did see throughout the election period, I should say, we saw double the visits on our website, and that was true as well on election night, more than double what we had in the last two elections, which were pretty stable. So that created a firewall to go into what we call protection mode. And to stop the traffic from penetrating or slow it down significantly such that it was very difficult for most Canadians to get access. A couple of things. One is that at that point, we had to identify the source of the problem. We were very quickly informed, working with Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, that it was not a cyber attack. So this was almost instantaneous. We knew that that was not the case. Our service provider, however, was not able to identify in real time the source of the problem. So there's a few lessons learned from that event. Of course, from the service provider point of view, they have augmented significantly the capacity of their firewalls. They've replaced the firewalls with much greater capacity and doubled them. We've also introduced protocols where we will be monitoring more actively their pre-election tests rather than let the commercial partner do their tests. We will want to be more involved in seeing the tests that take place. So they're very committed to that. We did have a fail-safe, a couple of fail-safe solutions. One is that there's a separate channel that provides the results to the media consortium. So the results kept flowing through the media consortium to the media, and that's through a different channel. And that's an important safety that we will, of course, maintain. And we had an alternative replication of our website across the world in thousands of servers, except that replication, two things. One is that it's a static website. We're looking into that. It provides information, but not live information. And we, in hindsight, took too long to switch to that static website. We should have switched sooner. So we're drawing lessons from that event and making sure it does not happen again.
This segues well into my next question about the live results were still being distributed to the media. When I was declared the winner on election night, I did a screen print of the results and posted it to social media and said thank you to all the voters. When I checked the results the next morning, I was down 1,300 votes from the results posted on election night. And there was something that, now, fortunately, my opponent was down by about the same amount, but we saw this in Terrebonne and in other ridings where the results changed from one day to the next. I was wondering if you could explain how it's possible to lose 1,300 votes from election night to the morning of the next day, and why there are these discrepancies in the results being reported to the mainstream media.
I'll have to, Mr. Chair, look into that question more deeply in terms of losing votes, because that would be surprising. What is not surprising is that election night results do vary between election night and validation. That's why there's a validation. In fact, if you look at the Elections Act, preliminary results do not exist in the law. That's something that we, of course, provide as a matter of tradition, and Canadians and candidates very much want it. But it has to be clear that on election night, with poll workers calling in results being hand entered into systems, there are late at night fatigue that comes into play and human error, and that's why the validation process is so important. And there's always some variation between election night results and the validation. So that is not unusual. We also sometimes see important swings in the vote simply because, for example, if a group of advanced poll results come in late at night and they're in a part of the district that tends to favor one candidate, you can see a swing happening, and that sometimes people are concerned about that, but that's not unusual. But we will look into your situation, certainly, and we can talk about that.
And addressing, you said disinformation. In your words, I believe you said disinformation was the biggest threat. And so what specific disinformation narratives did Elections Canada encounter during the election, and how do you address something like that in real time? In your words, you've got a month and change to address this. What are the challenges there, and what did you see as far as disinformation?
So there was a number of narratives, not necessarily surprising ones. We see similar narratives emerge in different jurisdictions, whether it's the UK, the US, and they tend to circulate in Australia, for example. So, for instance, a very common, probably one of the most dominant one in this election was the idea that pencils were provided so that votes could be erased. And, of course, that's not the reason why pencils are provided, and people can use a pen if they so wish. But that is something that is entirely predictable. And so these kinds of narratives, as we observe them around the world, we prepare and we provide. One of the resources was Electoral. So we had a list of common false narratives or incorrect narratives with correct information on them. So by preparing this in advance and by having a range of information on every aspect of the electoral process, we were ready to respond quickly to point people to the correct information.
And it's an immense undertaking to have a general election in a fair and conclusive manner. But there were some challenges, which you highlight in the report, and I want to talk about one which hits close home to me in the riding of Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, which is right across the river from my riding of Langley Township, Fraser Heights. So just to set the context, the special ballots that were cast in that riding by electors who did not live in that riding amounted to 822 ballots, and they were not counted.
included in the official count because
So
they will be reflected, except where there are issues with secrecy of the vote. They will be reflected alongside the official count.
okay, so that's important to know. There were 7 electors in my riding. It wouldn't have made a difference, and your report does highlight that. You say the outcome would not have affected any of the 74 impacted districts. Might be one of them. That is true. There were 7 ballots that were cast by people living in my riding, and happily I won by more than 7 votes. So even if they had all gone the other way, I still would have won. But I want to tell those people your vote actually did count, because that's what I tell everybody. When I'm knocking on doors, they go, "Mr. Van Popke, you're going to win anyways. It doesn't matter if I vote." I go, "It matters a lot.
It matters.
Every vote counts."
Mr. Chair, apologies for interrupting. It matters. I wholeheartedly agree. And to all extent possible, we want to make sure that every valid vote is reflected, is counted. Now, if for some error that happens after validation, that we find out, it cannot be included in the official results. In the case of Coquitlam, a large percentage, I can't remember exactly, of the affected ridings had done their validation when the issue rose, so that was not a possibility. It was nevertheless important to be very transparent about the situation, because some of those ridings were fairly close, not so close that it would have made a difference, but perhaps sufficiently so in the case of a recount. And it was critical that the candidates in those ridings be made aware of the number of votes that potentially would have affected their election, and should they wish to do so, could have raised this in the context of a recount. So after validation, if we find out, we need to be very quick to be transparent to make sure that these rights can be properly exercised.
So what happens if if this is discovered after validation? I just need to be clear on that. Would they be, and if the outcome would have been different? Yes. Would it have been a recount, or would you have invalidated the prior validation? So
that's a good question. This is not something that we've encountered before. I would be very reluctant, but I won't rule it out, to undo a validation. I think that could be seen as circumventing the remedy in the Act for recount. My preference would be to make the information available to the court in a recount so that the judge may take into account those votes and leave the court process to determine that. There are several guardrails and remedies in our system, and that's a good thing. Obviously, we don't like to see contested election, and so the recount or the validations are the two opportunities to make sure that the right candidate has been elected.
I'm going to give you a hypothetical. I'm looking at the 74 ridings, and they're written out in your reports and alphabetically. I looked up Terrebonne just when Ms. Normandin was asking some questions, and it is not listed there. So nobody in Coquitlam voted in the Terrebonne election. But if it had been, what difference would that have made to a declaration in that Quebec riding?
Had that been the case, my hope is that the information being available could have been taken into account by the judge in the recount, so before going to a contested election.
What are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? And what actually did happen? Like a ballot box got lost. How can that possibly happen? So in the case of Coquitlam, we have a situation where there was confusion about the process. We have a team there that worked provincially and was confused with the different rules. Provincially in BC, the special ballots are sent to the headquarters after the election for the count. Federally, that's not the case. Now, this is something that ought to have been understood. It's very clear in our material, but we will, and we have begun to look at all the controls that can be implemented to make sure that these kinds of errors are picked up immediately and corrected before validation. So I've indicated publicly, Mr. Chair, that we will be introducing changes to our processes.
30 seconds over, but it was an excellent question, and use my prerogative. I would have wanted to hear the answer. So thank you. Mr. Maloney.
I want to go back to this so-called longest ballot issue. I think we can all agree that it's outrageous. I mean, if we're being frank with each other, this thing, if it had a purpose, I'm not sure anybody understands what it is anymore. So in my personal opinion, we need to find a way to stop it. This is not a partisan issue. It's an issue that impacts all the parties in different ways at different times. I mean, it was an issue in Battle River Crowfoot. It was a battle in Mr. Poilievre's previous riding, the one he lost. The name escapes me at the moment. But it was also an issue in previous by-elections where Liberals won the race. So it affects us all equally. Look, in Battle River Crowfoot, one of the candidates, I believe, was from my riding. I don't know that she's ever been there. I'm not even sure she could find it on a map, frankly. So we need to stop this. So my question is, what steps can be taken to do it? For example, to register as a candidate, you have to submit your papers, you have to go through some sort of interview process, but you don't have to do it in person. I know of circumstances where the person who was responsible for doing interviews spoke to somebody on Zoom or Teams. The person wasn't in the city, the person wasn't in the province. I'm not even sure they were in the country, they were on a boat. I understand, this helps. It helped particularly during COVID in certain circumstances, but is there any thought being given to requiring in-person attendance for people when they're going through this process to conduct the interview when they submit their papers?
Thank you for the question. I would be reluctant to require an in-person presence. We have very, very large electoral districts in Canada, probably some of the largest, if not the largest in the world. Nunavut, to take an example, is almost 2 million square miles and very limited communications across the riding. That creates a range of challenges, of course, for candidates and elected MPs. But in large districts, to require the presence at the office of the returning officers, even where we have satellite offices, may present challenges for some of the candidates. So that's not something that I have considered, just to be clear.
I wasn't originally going to start here, but I am just curious because you mentioned it about the pencil issue. So would it be beneficial, I guess, to just go back to Elections Canada providing pens at voting booths in order to deal with this misinformation issue that was out there? Or is that something that you would consider going forward, is going back to pens?
It's something that so to be clear, I don't believe we ever did use pens at polling stations. We've all used, as far as I know, always used pencils. The benefit of pencils, beyond the fact that they are economical, is that they don't dry up. And they don't smudge. So if you start using ball pens, for example, and you stored them for 4 years and the leftovers stay on for some pencils have been in our boxes for several cycles. They're always working. If you buy pens, you have to verify that they work. And even if they do work, sometimes they may smudge, and that could cause ballots to be rejected. So our preference is for pencils, but we do not disallow the use of pens.
Thank you for that. Just trying to deal with this misinformation issue. There may be an additional cost, but on the information side and dealing with credibility questions about ballot, perhaps that is worth the cost. But when you talk about smudging, for example, I understand that is an issue on the physical ballot itself. But I would like to try, as parliamentarians, I think we all would, to try and combat some of those issues, again, in a nonpartisan fashion if we can. So if there's anything we can do, please let us know. In terms of the report, it was very comprehensive. I agree with my colleagues' comments on that. It states that more than 60% of voter information cards were either mailed late or not at all. And I understand with labor disruptions and just the general context of mail delivery these days, I'm skeptical that is likely to improve going forward. So in terms of the voter information cards themselves, if 60% can't be delivered on time, have they outlived their usefulness? Or what does Elections Canada recommend? Would you consider other types of delivery providers to ensure that 60% figure not getting delivered on time is very high, in my opinion? Have you considered other options to get those cards on time, or are they past their usefulness?
So thank you. That's a very rich question. I'll try to peel the different parts of the onion. Just to be clear, 60% were mailed late. That's after day 24, which the Act provides they should be in the mail at day 24. I believe it's something like 17%. It's a much lower figure that arrived late, and for me, late is after advance polls have begun. So, of course, we want that to happen before advance polls, but it's critical that they happen, that they be received before polling day. So that's the first point. The second point, Mr. Chair, is that it's not primarily a mail delivery problem. In this election, a challenge that we faced was the inability not of finding, but confirming polling locations. In many cases, what we see is that it takes a lot more time to negotiate leases, whether it's school principals, school boards, commercial landlords, with lawyers and boards that they report to, having to validate and approve the leases in a way that was not the case before. So it's no longer a handshake or a phone call and a quick signature. It's a long process. And then the returning officer moves to Plan B, and Plan B is the same long process, and Plan C is the same long process. So the challenge, the main challenge, is securing polling locations in a timely way, and that's why I said that the calendar in a fixed date is not a problem, but outside of a fixed date, that really creates an important pain point.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question, because I know I'm running out of time in this round, about my constituency. I heard a lot, and again, I'm a new candidate, about a couple of locations, Hobbs Manor in Brandon, which is a seniors' residence, and La Riviere and Cypress River, two communities that have had polling stations in them for time immemorial. Nobody can remember an election where they didn't have a federal polling station. All of those places did not have one this time. So it has the population threshold to have a polling location changed as part of this election? Or why would these long-standing communities that have always had a polling location not have had one? It, particularly in the two rural towns, it severely impacted because there is no public transit available in these communities to get to the next community over for residents to be able to vote, etc. So it was a significant barrier for all of those locations.
And I do appreciate that. We did not raise the threshold in any way for locations for assigning polls. We had more polls in this election than in previous elections. The ability to find one that is suitable in the right location is where the challenge is. So it's not about Elections Canada wanting to reduce the number of polls, quite the contrary. For me, especially for polling day, the last chance to vote, proximity voting has always been top of mind and is critical, and that's one thing that we strive to achieve. If I may, Mr.
We have 2 hours. Yes, I will.
On your initial question, we are looking at options. So voters can go online at any time and find their polling location. Of course, once it's confirmed, they don't need to wait for their voter information card. We would like to allow electors to download their voter information card in digital format. Now, that would not replace the paper one because for some electors, that's just not an option. But I do believe that over time, the paper voter information card may go away. But that's not for the immediate future. I think we need to have multiple layers as we move forward. Thank you.
Just out of curiosity, we know the advance poll this time was held on Easter weekend. Many of the faith communities that might hold polling stations did not this time. So was it situational that there was a challenge to secure enough voting locations, or is this an ongoing challenge? And also, did the new boundaries impact that at all? I know in my riding of Guelph, which is the home of the robocall, you may recall, there was some confusion around the new boundaries, and people who had always sort of crossed the street to go and vote could no longer do that. So were those factors at all?
Broadly speaking, I would think not. Certainly, returning officers had to adjust to new boundaries, especially experienced returning officers who had contacts established in the past with certain locations. That was an adjustment. In Ontario, in particular, because we used to share the boundaries with provincial boundaries, and we do share some of the returning officers, they had to, because we had back-to-back elections, they had to move from one boundary to another and make adjustments. So there were challenges there. But speaking to the CEO of Ontario, he had a huge challenge confirming polling sites. And he didn't change his writings. And so I don't think it's it's unique circumstance. I think we have to accept that the difficulty stems from a range of legal and social factors. I think today, school principals, if they have a badminton tournament organized in a school, will not cancel it without consulting the parents, going to the council. They're reluctant to do that. Commercial landlords have lawyers, and they often own many properties, and they have standard processes, and these standard processes are not designed for turnaround times as we need them during an election. So I think it's an evolution of the market and how the real estate market for polls.
I'm going to ask Mr. Perot you some questions about the so-called longest ballot committee, which you reference in your report. In the last election, this group targeted the Carleton riding, although prior to the last election, they targeted several by-elections, and then later targeted the Battle River Crowfoot riding in the recent by-election, with a total of 91 candidates in Carleton, a record 203 candidates in Battle River Crowfoot. Would you agree, broadly speaking, that the committee's tactic to flood the ballot with an endless list of candidates had a overall disruptive and negative impact on the electoral process in Carleton, in the prior by-elections, and in Battle River Crowfoot?
Certainly, it did have such an impact, and it was a challenge for a number of voters, especially those with disabilities, to be able to cast their ballot with such a long list of electors. And that is why, Mr. Chair, I've come to this committee in the past and recommended some changes to make sure that this can be addressed.
And just to sort of flesh out some of the challenges that this committee created, you referred to voters with disabilities. That would include voters with visual impairments, mobility issues, literacy challenges. Would that be correct?
I would include as well voters with dexterity to handle such a large ballot. People who are physically impaired, who have limitations, would also face a challenge.
So it negatively impacted on voter autonomy.
That is that's what we find, yes.
And further to that, in the Carleton riding, it resulted in longer lineups at the polls?
It certainly resulted in longer lineups. Of course, much longer processes to count the ballots, as we're aware. We had to advance the count for 3 hours for the advanced polls count during that day, and the count extended throughout the night.
And in Battle River Crowfoot riding, it necessitated the adoption of an adapted ballot. And I presume that also created its challenges. Is that fair for certain voters?
Certainly, voters, for example, who would use the Braille list to cast a ballot would have a different experience. So yes, it does create challenges. Electors with low literacy or people who have difficulty writing, manipulating a pen or pencil, may find that to be challenging. I think from my perspective, one of the important points also is the fact that it requires me to set aside the rules that Parliament has passed for the format of the ballot. And that's something, of course, that I had to do to make sure the election could proceed. But as I said before this committee, it's not something that I do lightly. And that's why I hesitated before moving to a write-in ballot format, which is a greater variation from what is prescribed in the legislation.
Now, you mentioned that you had recommended some amendments to the Canada Elections Act. I know that in September 2024, following disruptions that occurred in by-elections, you wrote to the then Minister of Democratic Institutions, Dominic LeBlanc, to express your concerns about the impact of the longest ballot committee and proposed an amendment to the Canada Elections Act. Did you receive a response from the minister?
I'd just like to, Mr. Chair, to also mention that I shared, of course, that recommendation with the committee as well. It wasn't just to the minister. In terms of a commitment to make the changes, I did not receive a commitment to make that change.
Now, that recommendation was was what? Just if you could elaborate on that.
So my recommendation was to ensure that the 100 signatures that are currently required, a bit less in some of the remote ridings, low-density ridings, that the 100 signatures be unique signatures. That a person, and I believe that is the philosophy of the legislation, though not the letter, that a person who endorses the nomination of a candidate endorses the nomination of that particular candidate and not just any candidate, whoever that candidate may be. And I believe that that is the approach of the longest ballot committee signators, that they endorse anybody and everybody who wishes to be part of the long ballot initiative. So I don't think that's aligned with the spirit of the legislation. I also caution, however, that the requirement, should it be implemented, the requirement to have unique signatures should be something which may carry a fine, for example, could be a few $100s, could be $1,000, but should not be caused to invalidate a nomination. As a candidate, the candidate would not know that a signature, a good faith candidate, would not know that somebody has signed on to somebody else's nomination paper. And the last thing that we would want is to have returning officers having to verify the 100 signatures to chase down, the potential double signatures, which may be in good faith. It may be somebody who was confused and wanted to be supportive, didn't understand the rules. But we don't want, certainly, a candidate nomination to be questioned just because one of the 100 names happened to be in somebody else's nomination paper as well. So my recommendation was that there be a prohibition for double signatures, a prohibition on inducing or encouraging people to do that, accompanied by sanctions. Again, it could be a fine, but without such a rule invalidating the nomination of any candidate. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, unless the candidate induced himself, or...
I also understand that there are special protections in place during election periods against misleading publications, undue foreign influence, and broadcasting outside of Canada. Could you explain what these are and whether you think these protections need to apply outside of specific election periods as well?
I have to refresh my memory here, Mr. Chair, but there's a range of provisions, of course, regarding the undue influence of foreigners that have been enacted that speak to the use of funds to facilitate, to support the vote for a candidate or party or oppose a candidate or a party by a foreign entity. And these provisions right now apply only during the election period. So that's something that in my report that I mentioned earlier that I made last fall, I did suggest that it be expanded outside of the election period.
I'm quite interested in AI and deepfakes, specifically in relation to foreign interference. Could you speak to what we do in order to disrupt these kinds of attempts?
That's a challenging question. I think transparency is the greatest tool that we have, and in my case, we are looking at specifically, this or misinformation about the electoral process. But of course, the integrity of the overall electoral process also needs to consider deep fakes regarding candidates and parties and so forth. And so that's why I think the law needs to be re-examined with that in light. It's an evolving threat. There was concern raised by the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity ahead of the election. They are playing catch up as everybody else regarding the ability to detect and to identify synthetic content that may be misleading. I think platforms have an important role to play as well in making sure that they filter out synthetic content. They are the technical experts, and I believe that they have a responsibility vis-a-vis that kind of content, especially in an election period.
Fantastic. My final question is on the recent election we saw, the by-election we saw in Ballot River Crowfoot. The ballots were 97 centimeters long, 30.5 centimeters wide. Could you speak to the choice of having voters write in their names and what kind of impact these had on increasing kind of the resources the Elections Canada had to allocate towards that election?
So in Carleton, where we had the long ballot with 97 candidates, we did have to send in people from headquarters. We believe around 40 staff members were sent in to facilitate the count and throughout the election period to support the returning officer at nomination, for example. And so there was extensive hand-holding to support the work there. That's not something that we could have done as well at a distance in Battle River Crowfoot. The numbers were immensely superior, not 93, but 214 if I remember correctly, names on the ballot. So we had to shift and take a different approach. So we did have the write-in ballot. We did have staff on site to support the returning officer, especially for the nomination, confirmation of nominations. Overall, in hindsight, I think it worked well. But as I said, it's not something that I would want to do regularly.
I want to follow up on Mr. Maloney's questions with respect to verifying the validity of signatures for nomination papers of candidates. Just so that I'm clear, is it the case that at present there is no verification done by Elections Canada, that when signatures are presented on the forms that they're taken at face value?
Just to be clear, there is no counter information. We don't have on record the signatures of all Canadians to make that comparison, nor would the returning officers have the expertise. Signatures can change. So the very concept of verifying each and every signature to make sure that they're authentic is one that is incompatible with the nature of the process.
Well, so they're taken at face value.
There's a verification that these electors reside in the electoral district and that the numbers are correct. If there are allegations of fraudulent behavior, then that can be addressed in the context of an investigation. That takes a lot more time.
So why not verify or audit signatures? I mean, there was evidence, for example, in the case of the longest ballot committee, that there were organizers going around with nomination forms, and at the top where it said name of candidate, it was blank. Now, not anyone can go out and collect signatures. You actually have to be authorized by someone running to do that. So what would be difficult for Elections Canada to simply undertake some kind of audit, not necessarily going through each and every person who signed, but picking up the phone or knocking on the door or communicating in some way to verify that, in fact, the individual who appears to have signed the paper did sign the paper, and that they did sign it understanding that they were endorsing a specific individual whose name they wished would appear on the ballot.
There are just a couple of points to answer, hopefully, your question. On the issue of blank names at the top, the name of the candidate has to be ascertained, or the potential prospective candidate. There cannot be a blank check. And we have refused in past election. The initial iterations of that initiative involved having a blank check, basically people signing on without an identified candidate. That is not acceptable. Okay, so it has to be a known candidate identified to the person who signs to support the nomination of that candidate. The issue of verification, as I said, we do not have on record signatures of Canadians, so there's nothing to compare to. It would really require an investigation to find out if these are all false signatures. That is not something that we would do lightly. I don't think there's any suspicion that there was fraudulent conduct in those long ballot initiatives. We have no information that people forged signatures. If there was such information that was basically credible information or suspicion, we would refer that to the commissioner.
It's not necessarily forged signatures, but if you present someone 10 different papers and ask them to sign 10 different times, and then after the fact, the name of a candidate appears at the top of that form, and the form is altered after the signatures have been collected, then that raises questions, is it not, about the validity of that candidate and whether there was compliance with the Canada Elections Act?
It certainly does, but I'm not aware of any evidence to that effect.
Well, perhaps you should be. And perhaps that evidence will be presented if you haven't seen it. But I guess it just underscores the fact that I guess it speaks to the fact that what is so difficult about Elections Canada calling or taking some sort of mechanism, some sort of process to verify when you have these types of situations, whether they existed in the longest ballot committee or in other circumstances, that could quite easily be detected. It wouldn't take very long to realize that this had been going on. And wouldn't it also serve as a deterrent if there was some knowledge or awareness that Elections Canada was actually verifying that the act was being complied with?
So again, I have no information that would suggest there was unlawful conduct taking place, either by the leaders or organizers of the longest ballot campaign or by the voters who signed.
That's immaterial. That's immaterial. I asked.
If I may,
I asked about.
Mr. Cooper, your overtime. If we can, again, given the amount of time we have, Mr. Perot, finish answering your question, and then we'll move on.
Left alone. Until we have reasons to suspect their behavior, we shouldn't bother them with questions that put into question the authenticity of their behavior. There needs to be something to start with.
There were 57,440 ballots cast by electors living outside of Canada voting by mail, according to your report. That is a significant increase from the 27,035 cast in the 44th general election. Just wondering if you would be willing to submit to the committee a breakdown of which electoral districts these ballots were counted in.
Certainly, that's something that I can commit to providing after, of course, this session. Yes.
Wonderful. All three measures of accuracy for the list of electors, coverage, currency, and accuracy, were lower for this election than the previous general election, and in fact, I think they were lower than the election before that as well. So accuracy is trending down in these three categories since 2019. What are the causes of that? And do you think that's acceptable to deliver a secure and fair election? Or what are you doing to address those indicators trending downward?
So I certainly agree that the quality of a list is critical to the quality of the election, both in terms of making it accessible and the integrity of the process. So that's something that's important. Right now we have a coverage, or at the election we had the coverage of 95.2%. That is very slightly lower than in the past elections, very comparable, and an accuracy of 92.2, again slightly lower. If you compare that to 2019, which is a fixed date election, it was slightly higher, just over 96 coverage, because of the fact that we have the ability in a fixed date to do information campaigns ahead of the election and to promote people going onto the register ahead of time and either adding themselves or moving themselves if they have moved. So it is not at all surprising that you would see a difference between fixed date elections and non-fixed date elections. The numbers that we have here are comparable and historically on the high end of accuracy and coverage for the National Register of Electors.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, so comparing the numbers from 2021 to this election, to non-fixed date elections, but still less this time around than in 2021?
Yes, in 2021 we may have carried over a bit of the benefits. The difference between 21 and 25 are marginal. They're more significant between fixed date 19 and 25. So it's likely, I would speculate, that we carried over some of the benefits of the 2019 election into 2021. Whereas we have a longer time period here between the two elections, between 21 and 25, and so there's a bit of a degradation, a slight degradation of the coverage and accuracy.
And if I may, the safety net during the election is the revision. Any elector can go on our website, they call the office of the returning officers and get the record updated if needs be. So we had 1.3 million electors at the last election who did so, and which is in line a little more than we had in the 44th GE. to your point, but is way less than the 2.8 millions that we saw at the inception of the National Register of Electors 20 years ago. So the long arc of history, if I may say, goes in the right direction with respect to the coverage, currency, and accuracy of the National Register of Electors.
Thank you. And just my final question, your report talks about disinformation, as you mentioned, particularly on social media elsewhere, and the setup of a web page in many different languages that talks about what interference in elections, what pressure would look like, that type of thing. I'm just wondering how much activity did that section of your website get during this election, of voters coming forward and saying, I think I might have been influenced, I feel, this type of thing? And what does the process look like when you, as Elections Canada, get reports where people are concerned about activity that pressuring, that's taking place, pressuring people in elections? And where do you take that information? What does the process look like to ensure that those potential threats to a voter or voters are taken seriously and addressed?
So thank you. Just to be clear, the multimedia campaign in 50 languages is not really about, it is about information. It's about the basic information about the electoral process. It's not, it helps to fight disinformation, but it's different than the information on our website. We have, for example, Electoral Facts, which I mentioned earlier, which is specifically to correct mis or disinformation. So there are different tools that we have in place to promote correct information. As I said, we have a social media monitoring team, and when we see incorrect information, we have pre-approved responses that are prepared, that are ready to go, and that we can use our social media platforms to communicate directly to those voters on those platforms. When something new arises that is not captured by our pre-existing message, then there's an escalation process and a decision is made. In some cases, you have to decide whether an intervention would provide greater attention to someone who's posting than not, and measure the quality or the risk to the process that the misinformation carries. So there's a judgment as to when we intervene and with what kind of information. We always want to be factual, never provide opinion. We never say, for example, this is why you can trust election. We say, here are the safeguards. And so we let people make up their minds. So there's judgment as to what kind of language we use. But there's a process in place with a team to escalate if it's new, not pre-approved messages.
So I'm going to question about local returning officers. My understanding is that the Canada Elections Act requires that the names and addresses of the returning officers are required to be published in the Gazette, which I think creates a privacy concern, a safety concern, and connected to that, going back to the longest ballot issue, recognizing that most of these people who put their name on the ballot are there to create mischief, that gives them access to the voters list. What protections or safeguards are in place to make sure that those people are not using the voters list, for example, to finding my address in my home, so that they can put a protest group together and come and disturb my neighbors, or any other thing that they may be up to? Because I think once you recognize they're not there for legitimate purposes, I think you then have to build in extra safeguards to protect against it.
So, Mr. Chair, 2 points. First, on the safety point, I agree with that. That is something that I have recommended, that the address of returning officers not be published. That, I don't believe, serves a compelling purpose, and there are concerns that have been expressed by returning officers about their safety. We've seen that in other jurisdictions in the U.S., for example, and that was something that I believe was included in Bill C-65 in the last Parliament, and hopefully it could be revived. Access to the preliminary list is not open to unconfirmed candidates. It is open to the parties who ran candidates in the last election. I did make recommendation that it be restricted to the ridings where the party ran a candidate, or once they have a candidate in this election, of course, that they have access to that. But independent candidates, as we have in the longest ballot committee, do not receive the list of electors.
So in your report, you highlight some initiatives that have were designed to increase voter participation, and probably were successful in doing that. Advanced polling, for example, voting by mail, special ballots, voting on campus, and 44% of electors voted ahead of time before voting day, which is a very big increase and shows enhanced voter participation. I would agree with that. But that leaves 56% of people voting on voting day. Do you feel that enough attention was had to making it convenient for voters on voting day? And I asked that question in the context of what happened in another neighboring riding, Cloverdale-Langley City, where 90 to 100 polls were all in one location. A big public building, very convenient for Elections Canada to be able to do that, but maybe not so convenient for voters, some of who had to drive further than they were accustomed to driving, and in a heavy traffic zone.
Yeah, it's an important question. I'm always very attentive to the issue of proximity. For many voters, it's critical. And we have not, as we've seen over the last 25 years, voters migrate from ordinary poll to advanced polls. We have not reduced correspondingly the number of polling divisions at ordinary polls. So there are fewer voters today, way fewer, close to half, and I'll let Mr. O'Sell correct me here, but way fewer voters today per polling division than there were in the past. Now, this may or may not translate to more polling sites, because if you have a mega poll with 10 or 15 tables, then this may or may not, depending on the riding. If it's a suburban area with the local schools, you can easily have 10 tables and they're all neighboring. But there are circumstances where a large poll creates proximity problems. And so that is something that returning officers are well aware of, and they do strive to make the poll sites as accessible as possible. But as I said, the capacity to secure polling locations is increasingly difficult, and that's in some
even with
cases.
large numbers of public schools. I mean, I'm talking about a fairly urbanized riding.
Yes,
and there will be elementary and high schools all over the place.
Yes,
why not use those more?
We would love to use all the schools. That would be fantastic. My provincial counterparts in most provinces have a statutory right of access to schools. In Ontario, they don't even pay for the schools. That's not what I'm asking for. But they have that right, I don't. And it's education being provincial jurisdictions. We've seen a decline in the percentage of sites that are schools over the years. It went even lower during the pandemic and has gone back up. We're now at 22%, but it was significantly higher in the past. Schools are very convenient proximity places for electors. Unfortunately, parents are increasingly concerned about security, or increasingly concerned about activities of their children that are planned at the school for the weekend. So that puts principals in a difficult situation, and in some cases they simply do not wish to have polls at the schools. A
follow-up question on voter participation. In the report, you make the point that it improved substantially in this recent election, up to 69% voter participation, the highest, as you note, since 1993. But I did a quick research into voter turnout throughout Canadian history, and in 1958, the Diefenbaker landslide was 75%. And it stayed above 70% for a long time. Then it started to slip down, and now it's been a while since it's been above 70%. So I'm not usually a glass half empty person, but 69% means that 31% didn't vote. That's 9.8 million people. So what could be? So first of all, do you have that broken down into demographics, like who is voting and who is not voting? Is it older people not voting, younger people not voting?
We'll have that information later on. We do not have it at this time, but it will be compiled. There's some demographics, for example, are not as accurate. For example, ethno-linguistic communities, we don't have that data. Age, we do, right? So certainly we'll have more information on that. It is important to remind everyone that our mandate does not include promoting participation. That's the role of other players, including yourselves and your competitors. Our role is to make sure that services are available and that information is there for electors to exercise their right if they so wish to do. Now, of course, we're always happy to see high participation rate, but that's not something that we have a mandate to promote. We have to make sure that we can provide the services. And we saw in this election with a high turnout and a migration to advanced polls, the implication that this has for us. So when I speak of the turnout in my report and in my remarks, I'm looking at it largely from the angle of, can we meet that service demand? And as it shifts in time during the period, what are the implications for us to meet that mandate of offering services to Canadians?
Can you share your thoughts on whether we should ban political entities and third parties from accepting crypto money orders and prepaid payment products? And if so, why? What challenges need to be addressed to strengthen our political financing regime?
The problem, Mr. Chair, with those instruments is they do not provide transparency as to the original source of the contributor. And that's a key principle of our system, that we know where the money comes from. There's no, in my view, valid reason to use a prepaid instrument, a prepaid credit card, to provide money to a candidate or a political party. These tools may have a very valid purpose otherwise in our economy, but in terms of financing parties and candidates, I do not believe that they are appropriate.
So I have a municipal background, and in every cycle for a municipality, we look at voting methods, and in Ontario in the last election, a number of municipalities went to online voting. So I just want to ask the question, so I believe that paper ballots are the safest method currently, especially when it comes to the need for a recount. But I'm just wondering if you could tell us and Canadians, what is the state of research on alternate electoral methods, whether that is online, whether it's the use of tabulators, which are not connected to the internet clearly. So what other models are you looking at? And also, if and when there are any recommendations, do you come back with costed recommendations for that?
So there is not a unique way of voting that is the best way of voting. It depends on the jurisdiction, on the circumstances, whether it's a school board election in a remote area where online voting may make a lot of sense given the low risks, in that area and the challenges that they face. But at a national level, I'm a firm believer that we should not move to online voting. I believe that the paper ballot is critical not only to the integrity, but the trust of Canadians in the integrity of the process. So Canadians need to feel confident about their election, and I do not see that confidence at the federal level for online or electronic modes of voting. Now, that's a very different proposition than tabulation. Tabulation can be effective, it can be secure, it can be audited, it can be replicated. It involves the use of a paper ballot that is scanned, but it does not destroy the paper ballot. So there are many good uses of tabulation, and many provincial jurisdictions use tabulation. We do not, and I'm not looking at that for the moment. I have no plans to move towards tabulation, but that is something which could be considered. The geography that we have puts limitations on the distribution and the value proposition of sending tabulators. So even jurisdictions that use tabulation, Ontario is one, only use it in urban and suburban areas. They would not send in a remote area a tabulator. There's no business case for that. And in urban centers, they would not use a tabulator in a condo building with a single poll, where that just doesn't make any sense from a monetary point of view. So even when you go to tabulation, wall-to-wall all tabulation is not something that exists in most jurisdictions. I'm not sure I remembered the last question that you had.
In any event, time is up. I'd like to thank the witnesses. We are adjourned.